Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Epic Comic Book Wednesday. This is a world's finest collaboration between Michael K Vaughan and myself, where we talk about comic books on Wednesday to our devoted audience, 4 people. And I am the one who horned my way into an innocent event on Mike's channel, so he gets to pick what we talk about. Which, as you've seen if you watch Epic Comic Book Wednesday, can lead to disaster. But often our tastes in comics coincide, at least long enough to make it not painful. And there's one place where our tastes in comics coincide perfectly, and that is the greatest superhero of them all, Superman. And today we are picking an anthology. This thing, Superman, a celebration of 75 years. With the Wayne Boring Superman in the little thumbnail there, and then the Jim Lee Superman on the cover, and then you've got more classic Superman in the back there. This was not Mike's original choice, to my eternal shame. He originally suggested one of the first Superman anthology volumes in a hardcover. I think it probably was the first. It was a volume called Superman from the 30s to the 70s. And I've had that volume. As far as I know, DC made 4 of them. One for Superman, one for Batman, one for Wonder Woman, and one for Captain Marvel and the Marvel family. Maybe they made more, but those 4 are the ones that I know of, and I have had the Superman volume endless times. And so when he suggested it to me, I thought, oh well, yeah, absolutely. I don't know for 100% sure. I was at the moment pinned under a sleeping schnauzer, but I thought, oh, what are the odds? I certainly have that. And then when I was finally free, I looked, and I don't have it. So we had to shift to another Superman commemorative volume. Fortunately, fortunately 2 things. One, Superman from the 30s to the 70s will show up at the Prattle, and I will grab it now that I know that I don't have it. But 2 is that no matter what hardcover Superman retrospective anthology like this we talk about, we're going to be talking about a lot of the same issues. What these things are like, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are. This is 75 years. Of course, Superman is 10 years older than that now. But one of the challenges that you will face in an anthology volume like this is the urge to make it representative. You're going to have 2 competing, I would argue, contradictory impulses when you are the editor in charge of making an anthology like this. And keep in mind, when this anthology was made, that was right at the dawn of superhero comics companies being ideologically captured. So virtually everyone involved in the management of DC Comics at the time when this book was being put together hated Superman, and hated men, and hated white people, and were perfectly happy to say that online, on social media, that we know who our audience is, and we hate that audience. Just hate them. That's not really going to impinge on a volume like this too much, because Superman is a moneymaker. He is iconic. And the powers that be at DC and Marvel Comics, the 2 big superhero comic books companies, shamefully abrogated their responsibilities to control their editorial teams during the heyday of identity politics ruining comic books. They shamefully abrogated those responsibilities. They did not set a line. They did not set a rule. They did not say, if you're a writer or an editor or a colorist or an artist for our comic books, you don't have a social media at all. If you post on social media, you're fired. And also, these things are not your playground. You are a steward of these characters that are 80 years old, and so you can't do whatever the hell you want with them. If you run rampant, it's your editor's job to rein you in. If your editor runs rampant, it's your group editor's job to rein him in. And if all of you run rampant, we'll fire the lot of you and hire people who don't ruin the product. Even in an era when that was at its peak, you don't mess with the money. So an anthology like this could still be good. I still look at them. I reflexively look at anthologies like this with a twinge of worry. I worry that it's going to be an anthology dedicated to how horrible an imperialist and colonialist this character is. But when you make an anthology like this, you're going to have 2 competing goals. One is to make it representative of the long period in which the character has been appearing, and the other is to do a best of. And those aren't always the same. I would argue that they're mostly not the same, because best ofs of anything tend to be standout things rather than representative. And Superman has a long history to go through. When you get the brief to do an anthology like this, you're going to know some of the things that you have to include. There's no negotiating with it, right? And when you're making an anthology, you want to know what those fixed points in time are. For instance, a Superman celebration of the first 75 years is going to have Superman's first appearance in Action Comics #1. This one starts off with it's incredibly primitive. It has been retconned to death, but you still have to include it. You have to include that issue. And then after a while, of Superman appearing for a while, DC Comics has finally got its act together with Superman reprints. So you have a whole shelf of big Michael K. Vaughan style 130-page or 1,000-page hardcover omnibus volumes reprinting everything, the whole run of Action Comics, the whole run of Superman, up until the Bronze Age. But a lot of them. There's a lot of Superman reprint material out there, and more all the time. As those early adventures are going on, the character is evolving. Slowly, the character is evolving. And especially, the character is gaining a gigantic backstory. In that first appearance of Superman, the planet Krypton is not even named. We're just told that the reason Superman can do all the weird things he can do is because he's not from Earth. He's an alien being. As opposed to being a scientific experiment gone wrong, which would have been the default explanation at the time, in the 30s. Later writers, under later editors, decided to expand on that Kryptonian heritage an enormous amount. Just enormous. So you get a very detailed story about Superman's origin, and you get to see that origin. You get to see the origin in its classic outline. That Superman is the biological son of a scientist on the planet Krypton who is trying to convince the Science Council that the planet Krypton is doomed. And we should be building a fleet of space arcs to get us off this planet before it blows up. And they don't believe him. He's a doomed prophet type figure telling them the government needs to throw all its resources behind getting everyone off this planet safely before it blows up. And he knows they're not listening to him, so he decides to build a prototype rocket on his own. And for reasons that have never been retconned, John Byrne, the famous writer and artist, fan favorite, wanted to retcon this particular detail, but the reason it's never been retconned into existence. For some non-retconned reason, this scientist on Krypton makes the rocket small enough for a baby, instead of big enough for a family. He has a wife and a baby. He doesn't build a prototype. And this is not the prototype that sends little baby Kal-El to Earth is not the first prototype. This scientist, Jor-El, has been working on this thing for a while. He's already sent a living being into space in a previous prototype rocket. So why he doesn't make his rocket big enough for himself, his wife, and his child is never explained. But that origin, it's never explained beyond the obvious explanation, which is that you don't want to retcon away Action Comics #1. You don't want to retcon it away completely. And in that story, although the planet is not defined in any detail, we know that there was one survivor, that one baby was rocketed to Earth. Later writers and later editors expand on that. They give us the nature of Krypton, the wildlife of Krypton, the history of Krypton. Superman, when he gets to Earth, has a panoply of superpowers, and one of them is a super brain, a super perfect memory, so he can remember Krypton just a bit from when he was a baby. And also, he gets to go there. He gets to time travel. He time travels in this. Volume. So he goes back to meet his father and mother on the planet Krypton. And you have what-if stories like that amazingly fleshed out the backstory of the character, while at the same time you could argue making him less unique. The standard run-of-the-mill narrative gimmick for goosing up a Superman half-year was for him to stumble across another survivor of the planet Krypton. most famously being his own cousin, his own first cousin, who lived through the death of Krypton. Not just anyone, not a random person that he might hate, but a family member. But there were at that period in the middle of this volume, there were many other such characters. Whether they survived through some odd means that a writer thinks up, or of course whether they survive in the Phantom Zone. Superman's father, that scientist Jor-El, in addition to worrying that Krypton is going to explode, creates a doorway to an alternate dimension where criminals can be sent, where they are phantoms. They don't have a body anymore, but they are conscious, and they spend a certain amount of time in the Phantom Zone for their incarceration rather than being physically in prison. And as fans pointed out right away when the Phantom Zone was introduced, well, that would mean that they survived the destruction of Krypton. So who knows how many Kryptonians you have in the Phantom Zone that are still alive when Superman is growing up. Of course, writers were quick to pounce on that and have lots of figures come and go from the Phantom Zone. As you're growing that legacy, slowly adding to it, the normal run for an editor was you come on and you are a caretaker of all of this. So you can add to it a little, you can tweak it here and there, but you can't fundamentally change it. And so by the mid 1960s at the latest, you have a pattern set in place where Superman is upright, he is moral, immovably moral, and he's also a god. He's physically unopposable. So you have to come up with other stories than that. The story can't be every week in and week out. The story can't be, is this new villain going to be able to hurt Superman? The story can't be that, because nothing can hurt Superman except kryptonite. You can load your story with that, but if you don't have that, then when a bad guy punches Superman, he's just going to stand there. That it would in the 1950s, that would have been viewed as poor storytelling. You would have been called on the carpet in Julie Schwartz's office and told, what on earth are you doing here? You got this guy, this villain, Atom Man. He robs a bank. Superman tries to stop him, and he punches Superman in the face. What's the point of that? That stopped being true once an entitled generation of characters, a post-war generation of creators, got hold of this character. Suddenly, the writers and editors for Superman started thinking they started thinking something that no Superman fan had ever thought. All the young people buying these comics all throughout the United States, not one of them had ever thought, well, Superman would be a lot more interesting if he were weaker. None of them ever thought that. Not one of them ever thought that. But periodically, his editors do think that. Not because they really think, well, this character would be more interesting if he's weaker, but because they think that my job as a writer would be easier if he was weaker. There'd be more of a challenge to him, as if earlier writers and editors didn't face that challenge and do it rather handily. The point that I'm trying to make is that after a certain point, in the late 80s, the mid 80s and late 80s, suddenly Superman became subject of revision. Editorial revision. Not just editorial accretion, where you're adding on little details here and there, but you're not changing anything fundamental, but rather wholesale revision. Now that was suddenly dawned on the reading public with the aforementioned John Byrne, who in the wake of a company-wide reboot event called Crisis on Infinite Earths was given command of the Superman titles and told, you can reinvent this character. You need, the costume has to stay the same, the marketing has to stay the same, the origin has to stay the same in broad outline, but you can have a freer hand to reinvent this character than any writer has ever had before. And John Byrne did a whole bunch of things. He reinvented a whole bunch of stuff about this character. Lex Luthor, for instance, is no longer a mad scientist. He's instead a frustrated businessman who once had a romantic relationship with Lois Lane. And Superman was no longer a superpowered character as a teenager. No longer had Krypto the Superdog. No longer had the Legion of Superheroes. And also, most fundamentally, Superman was much, much weaker. Physically weaker. you get a writer to come on and make changes like that. If you're a loyal fan, you just sit back with a heavy sigh and wait for it all to be retconned back to normal. This is normal. Not 100%. Those of you who are old Superman fans will recognize a bit of retconning on this cover. For 50 years, when Superman used his heat vision, his eyes did not glow. That was I remember the first panel I saw that had that effect. It's actually in this book. But mostly, and once you open the door to revisions like that, well, you know where you're going to go. I mentioned this before in connection with the Stan Lee era of Marvel Comics. Once you introduce, what is a revision? A revision is verisimilitude. It's time has passed, so things won't be the same. It has no place in superhero comics. Verisimilitude, of course, has no place in a comic book devoted to a superpowered alien. But once you introduce that, once you introduce verisimilitude, once you introduce the Stan Lee virus, there's only one place it can go. Sooner or later, slower or faster, it will get there. And that is death. That is death. Death will enter the comics. Not Jor-El and Lara dying when Krypton dies, but your character dying. And so that happened. And you have to include that in here as well. That's what I mean by the conflicting urges of making an anthology. When you're looking at Superman over the course of 75 years, well, there was a best-selling Superman storyline in which he dies. It's dumb, but you have to include it. There was a best-selling era of Superman in which he was physically weak. You can't just ignore that era, so you have to include it. There were a whole bunch of other things, too. There was a brief, lamentable era where Superman had a weird hairstyle. Business in the front and party in the back. There was an even briefer period where Superman had electric superpowers. The whole nature of his superpowers changed. He was no longer super powerful, super strong, and invulnerable and whatnot. Instead, he was electric. And those things are blights. Attention grabbing, look at me, I've been giving too much control over this character. Periods like that are blights. You look back on, I don't even know, a run on the Justice League, for instance, where everything will be normal and there'll be great storylines and bad storylines, and then all of a sudden there'll be a little period where Superman is an energy bulb. Anyway, always Superman reverts to the norm. Not just because that is the classic version of the character, but also because that's where the money is. And that is what you have to reflect in a book like this, and you just have to do it painlessly if you can. And in this volume, we get the first half of it is excellent. We get all these great old Kryptonian lore-building stories. We also get one of the greatest Superman imaginary stories of them all. Every once in a while, a writer for Superman in the old days would propose an imaginary story where they did major changes to the character, but it was clearly marked as not in continuity. This is an imaginary story. This is not real. In continuity, this did not really happen. Fans love those stories, and I don't know why comic book companies decided at some point in the 80s, probably cocaine, that wasn't good enough anymore. Fans loved what-if stories. You could keep doing them. Instead of making it part of continuity that all of us have to then just carry for 10 years until someone brings it back to normal. There's always going to be a legion of superheroes. There's always going to be Krypto the Superdog. There's always going to be those things. Anyway, the story I'm talking about is Lex Luthor Hero, with artwork by the great Kurt Swan, where Lex Luthor, Superman's arch foe, appears to reconcile. He appears to reform. And he and Superman shake hands, and there is lots of doubt. Superman doubts him, keeps a close eye on him, but eventually, through Lex Luthor's genius, it really does seem like he has reformed, and he is embraced and beloved by the world. But it turns out in the end he didn't mean it. He was just trying to get Superman's guard down long enough to get him in a position to kill him. And in the imaginary story, he does kill him. And his legacy is carried on by Supergirl, but he is dead. And it is a tremendously good imaginary story, even at the time that it came out, I railed against it and said, this doesn't make any sense at all. Lex Luthor has to have a motivation. in this story, you are removing all his motivation to be evil other than simply that he knows he's a character in a comic book. He has to have a motivation. If the whole world loves him and he genuinely likes Superman as a friend and he's genuinely enjoying himself doing good instead of evil, you can't have a reveal panel in which he says, it was all a trick. I want to go back to being despised. I want to go back to hurting things. And anyway, I'm glad that they included it, and they also include a great story, Must There Be a Superman, where Green Lantern's bosses, the Guardians of Oa, asked that question, must there be a Superman? It ends up being a bit of a dud as a storyline, and from this era of Cary Bates and Kurt Swan Superman, I could have picked other stories, better stories than that. And the same thing is true for this next choice that they make. They decided to include something from the 45th anniversary of Action Comics. The 45th anniversary of Action Comics has a Gene Colan cover, and also the two main Superman villains are reimagined. Lex Luthor suddenly gets the iconic Lex Luthor battle armor, and Brainiac is changed into a robot. I mean, this Brainiac is a robot, but he doesn't look like one. Here he's changed into just a giant mechanical robot. And who wrote these? Marv Wolfman wrote this whole era of Superman. It was about 20 issues. And the great Gil Kane, the legendary artist Gil Kane, drew them. He had drawn Superman before, but have Gil Kane regularly on a Superman comic was a dream come true to old Superman fans. And he does great work all throughout, but he shouldn't be doing this issue. This issue should not be reprinted. Not only because it's a little bit counterintuitive to do a best of Superman story that mostly devotes its page count to Lex Luthor and Brainiac, not Superman. But also because it ends, let me show you, it ends on a cliffhanger, which obviously doesn't belong in an anthology volume. And the irony here is that the Wolfman and Gil Kane era of Superman, brief though it was, had a couple of self-contained, standalone single issues that I've praised on this channel before. They are incredibly good, writing and artwork, and without being a cliffhanger. So they epitomize the character far better than this does. But obviously, the person who put this, the people who put this anthology together, had landmarks in mind. They know that this is going to be a landmark, so they wanted to doff the hat to other landmarks. So we get the 400th anniversary edition of Superman with a Howard Chaykin cover there, and this had, as you can see, a gigantic roster of creators taking a whack at various aspects of the Superman mythos. I have this issue, but I'm glad that this segment of it is reprinted here, because this was my favorite segment in that whole issue. It's done by Frank Miller, who ordinarily I would not be praising in a Superman video, because his Dark Knight Returns did a lot of harm to Superman, the character, the concept. But in this, we get this is Miller in his classic controlled period, Klaus Janson, and he has a future historian talking about the myth of Superman, and that's a great bracketing gimmick anyway, but he makes it so much better because the Superman that he is talking about is George Reeves from The Adventures of Superman, the TV show, The Adventures of Superman. It's no other Superman that's being talked about here. It's just George Reeves, and the greatest Superman of them all. And that really warmed the cockles of my heart. And then you're at the halfway point. And you're doing a retrospective and you're going roughly chronologically. Well, then from here on out, you are dealing with a Superman who was vulnerable to editorial revisionings, which was never really true before. Now, all of a sudden, you have to step carefully, or you are going to include one bomb after another, as these coked up writers decide, I can do whatever I want with Superman. I can do anything I want with him at all. You have to step carefully. There are a few, I think, acknowledged masterpieces from that era. And in their credit, the people who put this volume together pick a couple of them. The foremost being perhaps the greatest Superman story of them all, For the Man Who Has Everything, from Superman Annual. I've gone through this particular issue many, many times on this channel. I've talked about it endlessly. It is incredibly good. A monstrous supervillain. imprisons Superman in the short form of it is the imprisons Superman in a world of imagination. So he's standing there dazed because in his mind he is living in the world where Krypton did not explode, where he's living a normal life on the planet Krypton, and that has incapacitated him. This villain wants to incapacitate him that way, while he then takes over Earth, and he's towering, so he has to squat down to talk to Batman, and he says, the villain's name is Mongol, and he says, I know, for example, that your society makes distinctions on the basis of gender and age. Perhaps then you could advise me. Which of you would it be polite to kill first? And we have this terrific Alan Moore artwork. And then we get a panel that perhaps caused me to write an angry screed to the editors. It is classic. For the man who has everything, it is classic. But this should not be true. It's just absolutely persistent when it comes to DC Comics. Because the minute Mongol says that he intends to kill these three, Batman, Robin, and Wonder Woman, Batman just immediately looks at Wonder Woman. She has superpowers. She recognizes why he's doing that, walks forward, and punches Mongol in the face. And it hurts her hand, and it discombobulates him just a bit, when it should have blown him across the hemisphere. But typically, this is just typical that DC writers do not want Wonder Woman to be Superman's equal. They just don't. They can't deal with that. She is. On paper, she is. In her best iterations, she is. This should not happen. That is sexism. But it doesn't matter because the rest of the issue is absolutely terrific. I won't belabor it, except to say that in addition to reading this issue, which is in every Superman reprint volume in the world, so you really don't need to worry about missing it, you also absolutely shouldn't miss the version of this in the Superman cartoon, the animated Superman cartoon adapted for The Man Who Has Everything. And they did a great job, an absolutely great job. Better in some ways even than the comic. They add to the comic in some ways, so definitely see clips from that. You'll be able to find clips from it on YouTube. I subject visitors here to Hyde Cottage to clips from that every time someone makes the bad mistake of coming here. But okay, so for The Man Who Has Everything that's solid. That's absolutely solid. That's going to stand no matter what. That's going to be in every Superman anthology no matter what. It is a high point, but you still have this era of editorial mucking around to deal with. And as I've mentioned a couple of times now in this video, the foremost architect of that in the pre-modern era is John Byrne, who got control of Superman and suddenly was the guy in charge and also drew Superman adventures. And I don't know, has enough time passed so that the rest of us can finally say what I was saying at the time, which is that these are terrible? And not just because Superman is weaker, but this is just terrible. This is dumb, terrible writing. Has enough time passed for us to say that? Probably not. John Byrne people tend to get nostalgic about him. But that's the era that we have to deal with him, is him drawing and writing Superman, where we get, 4-page panels, and don't be fooled, John Byrne drew none of the backgrounds on any of these panels. That was all done by, I think, poor Terry Austin had to do that. John Byrne is a visually appealing but very lazy artist, and got more lazy as time went on. And here you have, just a wacky adventure with the imp from the fifth dimension. There's no real thing you can draw from. This is another John Byrne thing. Isn't that an exciting page? It's just people endlessly talking to each other. Something he learned from Chris Claremont. But it'll be visually exciting, but nothing more than that. John Byrne had, in his entire era on Superman, he had one pretty good story that's not included in here. If you wanted to commemorate the John Byrne era, you could have done it. There's one pretty good story. It's like the third or fourth Superman story that he wrote, where Lex Luthor's underlings commission a super analytic computer to sift all the facts and determine Superman's real identity, and the computer determines that Clark Kent is Superman, and Lex Luthor is outraged. That is the kind of dumb conclusion that a computer would come to. That's pretty good. It's pretty good. It's not original. Cary Bates did that exact story without a computer 30 years before, right around the time when John Byrne was reading Superman comics. But anyway, that's not in here, though. Instead, you get this dumb Mixes-Pitalik adventure. But you've got to include something from the John Byrne era. You've got to include something from that era, no matter how bad it all is. And there's something else that you have to include from that era, which is, again, aforementioned. If you introduce the Stan Lee virus of verisimilitude, sooner or later, that is going to mean death. And if you are unfamiliar with anything that I'm talking about, first of all, why are you watching this video? But if you're unfamiliar with anything I'm talking about, you say, well, okay, maybe in other cases, but you can't have Superman die. Sure you can. Sure you can. And they did. DC Comics did famously the death of Superman. And you have to have that in here as well. And this has artwork by the absolutely awful Dan Jurgens, who, like John Byrne, is a fan favorite. I don't know why. Look at this panel. What is happening in that panel? Superman's right arm is wrapped around this monster's head, while his left arm is up behind his head, holding the monster's other arm, leaving himself wide open here. Superman is crouched down. But the monster this just makes physically no sense at all. None. And it is far, far from the only panel in here that makes no sense at all. None whatsoever. For instance, Superman is there in the wreckage of Metropolis, with Doomsday running rampant, while Superman, all bloodied and battered, is trying to fight this thing. And Lois Lane is right there at his elbow the whole time. He's practically saying, excuse me, Lois, I need to step around you in order to punch this massive space monster. He's practically saying that to her in every panel. He kisses her, yes, we get all these splash pages. He kisses her. But he is, here, let me give you my favorite example. She's standing right there while he's blasting this creature. She's 4 inches away from the beams of his heat vision. If she won't do it herself, why doesn't he use super breath to blow her out of harm's way? Or why, as I was yelling at the issue while I was reading it, since Doomsday can't fly, why doesn't Superman fly over, grab him under the arms at super speed, and fly him somewhere where there aren't people? Somewhere other than the middle of Metropolis, somewhere other than 4 inches away from the love of his life. Instead, we get one crappy panel after another. What is Superman doing in that panel? What is he doing in that panel? I know he's attacking Doomsday, but what physically is he doing? I have no idea. And it's not just that the structures are poor, it's also that the concepts behind them are poor. Doomsday grabs Superman by the feet and rams him headfirst into the ground. Is that how people work? Is that how anything works? Is Superman an I-beam? Is he a girder? What on earth? What on earth? How could anyone think that's any good? See, and this is another example. There's Lois. Don't worry about pictures now. We've got to do something. She's 4 inches away from Doomsday, and Superman just doesn't care. He just leaves her there. We have the aforementioned panel here. This is terrible. What is happening there? I have no idea. Also, memo to Dan Jurgens, Superman's heat vision is not a battering ram. It doesn't have any physical force. It heats things. So you're not slamming him away by hitting him with heat vision. And when this creature is jaggedly ripping Superman's chin, Superman is saying, bony protrusions so sharp they cut me. And then we get probably the most indicative panel to me that Dan Jurgens simply cannot do this. I don't know why he is revered. He's simply, at least John Byrne has a minimal compositional competence. Dan Jurgens doesn't have any. His characters are just stuck there, like kitchen magnets. Look at this panel. There is Superman fighting Doomsday, and Doomsday is yelling in pain, and you're thinking, why? Why is that? Is Superman crushing his fingers? No, down here, way down there in the bottom, Superman is kicking a spike off one of Doomsday's knees, almost out of the panel. That's how bad this is. Think for a second, even if you're not artistically inclined, you'll only need a second, to reimagine a panel in which the point of the action is also the point of the panel. It would be easy to do. It would be easy to redraw this in a way that shows Superman doing what he's doing instead of almost off camera. And then we get the quintessential moment. in this thing that you have to reprint in every Superman retrospective, which of course would not happen. They punch each other to death. They punch each other to death. And for what it's worth, the people in this who made this anthology include the 2-page spread there where Superman is dead. He lives long enough to ask if Doomsday is dead, and then he dies. But he's not really dead, and neither is Doomsday. So it's all just anyway, you have to include it. But another thing that people tend to want to include in Superman anthologies is this thing, where Superman meets a nihilistic supergroup, a group of super beings who just want to get things done, and they're not cinematic, and they don't care about right and wrong, and they just want to kill the bad guys. And they tell Superman that his way of doing things is very outdated. Truth, justice, and the American way, showing mercy, never killing. John Byrne's Superman kills, but the real Superman doesn't. This group is heavily patterned on the Authority, a supergroup that I don't think Mike and I have ever talked about. This is clearly the writer wanting to know what Superman would do if he went up against the Authority. Not physically, although he does fight them physically, but morally, ethically. What would he do if he went up against their nihilism? And I don't like the artwork here, but it's a pretty good story. It has one major flaw, which is that inevitably Superman ends up fighting these people instead of cautioning them. He ends up fighting against them. And that fight should go precisely nowhere. You've got a character who can exude huge amounts of electricity, grabs Superman, and megavolts him. You've got a character who has telekinesis and is using it to constrict Superman's blood vessels. What's wrong with all of that? Superman is invulnerable. So your telekinesis can't affect his blood vessels. No amount of electricity can hurt him. All he's going to do when you do that is say, it tickles. That's all he's going to do. He's invulnerable. So you can't hurt him. If you're a Kryptonian, maybe, but these people aren't. But the classic twist here in the story is that Superman fakes them out. He pretends that he has become as nihilistic as they have. And it shocks them, and it makes them cry and whine because they're expecting him to be truth, justice, and the American way. They're expecting him to be a big Boy Scout. And it reveals them for the ethical cowards that they are. And once it's a good enough story. Once again, I want to stress that the cartoon version of this story is much better. It is much better than the one in the comic. It's terrific. It is another Superman moment that I inflict on my visitors when they come here. And then we finish up, and you finish up the volume with a cute little coda by Alex Ross, who does some of the best Superman stuff, artwork-wise, in the modern era. Probably the best Superman stuff in the modern era. So you really can't do a volume like this without including him. And the editors found a cute little team up between him and Batman. Alex Ross's Batman is pretty good too, where you've got this beautiful cinematic stuff where Superman has briefly been mind controlled and Batman has to get him back under control, and it ends with them attacking Brainiac in his lair. And notice this is exactly what I'm talking about. First of all, look at the beauty of that panel. That is just amazing. But also notice what I'm talking about. Brainiac goes back to being Brainiac. He doesn't stay a stupid gray metal robot. These things have an internal consistency of their own. There's no use fighting it. And you might think, well, great, there you go. So you're done. You made it through. But no. Superman continues to have new iterations, new editors who think they can just do what they want with the character. And a while ago, 10 years ago, that happened with Superman, in Superman and in Action Comics. It was disastrous, and it was quickly retconned out of existence because Superman has a baseline. And this is not it. A guy wearing a bath towel as a cape and in overalls with boots, that is not Superman. There's not any version of Superman. But for a while it was, and you got these dumb adventures, all in brown, of Superman's early years, where he's at the Daily Star instead of the Daily Planet, and he's not sure about himself, and He's dressing like an emo kid at a costume party, and naturally, he's vulnerable. Okay, you've got a shoulder-mounted rocket launcher. You fire that at Superman, he stands there because he's invulnerable. You don't blow him off the building and make your fans wonder whether or not he's even still alive. You don't do that. And it might help while you're doing all of this, leading up to the rousing climactic panel. It might be good if you did something in a color other than brown. But they don't. This is all just brown. Just brown, brown, brown. All throughout. All of this dumb, stupid T-shirt wearing Superman. Which was no better. That was in, I think, Action Comics, but there was no better over in Superman where he was wearing armor. Superman needs armor. You look at stuff like that, big revision stuff like that, and you think, you're going to revert. You're going to revert to norm. You're going to do that. It's only very rarely that a writer will come along and hit on a major change that not only feels right, but that every fan loves. Where you don't get that angry letter from Iowa. You don't get it. Amazingly enough, in the modern era, a writer did come across that, the most natural thing in the world. What if Superman and Lois Lane not only married, but had a child? What if we get Superman as a parent of a little boy? There was a time, there were decades, when I would have said, no, you can't mess with the basic ethos of the character. You can't do it. And then a writer did it. And it worked perfectly. It was total surprise to me, exactly what we had been waiting for all this time. Superman is kind of a father figure to the whole super community. Of course it makes sense that he would be a father figure to his son. It was wonderful. And for a little while, it was wonderful until, unfortunately, the DC Comics right around that time was ideologically captured. And so the little boy, Superman's son, had to be quickly aged to a teenage dream pot so that he could be made gay. This was a triumph of identity politics. I have no idea what the current state of things is with that teenage son. There ought to be a retcon where he is retconned back to being a little boy, but you'd get hate mail. You'd be dragged on social media by 12 psychos, so maybe you won't ever do that. They'd say it was homophobic. But nevertheless, Superman is in a pretty good period right now in his weekly comics. Pretty good. Pretty standard stuff. Pretty standard in all the best ways. Standard in all the traditional ways. But that's for a later anthology to deal with. Sooner or later, there will be a celebration of 100 years. Sooner or later, that will happen. Sooner, far rather than later, that will happen. In very little time, that will happen. I'm only 28, so I will certainly see it. Michael K. Vaughan is bitterly old, but he might live to see Superman's 100th anniversary. Who knows what things will be like then. But outside of America, there will be anthology commemorative volumes made of this character, and they will have to include the era of the Super Sons, the era of John Kent, little boy John Kent, and maybe even older identity politics gay John Kent. And who knows else what's coming. But for now, this thing was terrific. Revisiting this was terrific. Just reminded me that creators come and go. On a character this iconic, creators come and go. And you just have to, if you're getting a bad period where Superman can barely lift a truck, isn't as fast as the speed of light, gets hurt, can get blown off a building by a howitzer. If you're living through a period like that, you just have to go. You just have to roll with it. Hope there's something good enough to keep you buying the issues, and then that someone comes along later and does a great revision back to norm. But anyway, that is Superman, a celebration of 75 years. Went long on this, of course, as I will with Superman. Sorry about that. But I'll leave a link to Mike's video down below. I'm sure his is up already. And I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.